Have you ever noticed that the secular world is obsessed with sex? I mean, you had to have noticed that, right? What other reason would our culture fund Moloch worship directly, through taxation of all things? What other reason would our culture be now witnessing a total cultural collapse, as is most evident at this moment, not only through institutionalized Moloch worship, but also all manner of impurity and confusion becoming not only normal, but celebrated by the culture itself, with dissent from this celebration being a sin in the eyes of the culture. What other sign of this do we need when smut is available and marketed towards young people and for free, and to the population at large? What other sign do we need that the culture is headed towards collapse? Well, I have another sign. Blaming the present scandals of the priests on what the church teaches and has taught for 2,000 years regarding purity. This argument came out in response to that statement made by Benedict XVI of last April, which you can listen to on this channel. The video I did on that statement is found in the pinned comments of this video. Benedict released his statement in April, and it caused quite a stir among Catholics around the world because he spoke sensibly about the crisis of immorality in the church, though many of us criticized it for not addressing theological errors that had been promoted in the church at that time and still are today, errors that he himself had been linked to directly. But that should be expected. Any way you look at it, though, Benedict's statement was otherwise extremely sensible and off-putting to many Catholics who worship themselves in a form of an elevated personal conscience, which puts their own judgment before the traditions and teachings of the Church. This week, Pope Benedict XVI responded almost humorously to criticism of his April statement on the scandals involving priests in the Church. To review, in April, Benedict released his statement that he had written for Francis and the Secretary of State, Pietro Parolin, which stated that at the core of the present crisis is the sexual revolution of the 1960s, which flipped the morality that had sustained Western civilization for thousands of years onto its head. Benedict recounted the post-war indoctrination of children and the population in general, with indecent films and programs in the schools, which led to a culture war that waged against the Germans and European people in general, and how this led to the normalization of indecency across the West. Much of what he has said has been known for quite a long time and been confirmed by the research efforts of various historians looking at our present cultural crisis. And they, like I said, came to the same conclusion that the retired Pope has come to. In his April document, Benedict notes the link between the destruction of moral norms and the sexual revolution, which led to a normalization of preying upon children and the spread of violence in the culture. None of this is politically correct stuff in an age where do what thou wilt is the rule of the day in the West, a rule that led to the fall of man in the garden, and a rule that is now leading to the fall of Western civilization. The criticism was made by a German academic with links to a special interest group that is working for women's ordination of married priests, and normalization of sexual sins that the Church and sacred scripture teach are moral crimes that lead to perdition, that are so violent that they cry out to heaven for vengeance. In other words, the criticism is made by a nominally Catholic Masonic Protestant who seeks to bring this destructive revolution into the Church. This battle is merely another front of the battle between Christ and Antichrist in the Church, and we have an example of this battle before us, with a lay Catholic who seems to know better than the Church does when the issue of human morality is raised. The criticism comes from one Professor Aschmann, whose work with a prominent German lay organization is to try to fix the crisis of Catholics not going to Mass in Germany, because they have some of the lowest rates in all of the West, and the vocations crisis that goes with it by aligning the Church's values to that of the world. Sound familiar? In my mind, that'd be a little like trying to cure a person who has ingested arsenic by giving them more arsenic. Professor Aschmann's criticism is remarkably close to that claim made by some extremely misguided Catholics who support allowing priests to abandon sacred and holy celibacy, a stance that I have never understood and a stance that is squarely in keeping with the modernist values and their claims about the origins of the abuse crisis in the Church. Aschmann actually blames Humanae Vitae for the present crisis in the Church, which, aside from being a stupid argument, completely ignores that the abuse crisis can be traced back to the post-war years of the 1940s and 1950s. The professor's argument goes something like this. She states that the Church disallows contraception, which is kind of a weird mischaracterization of what the Church teaches on that issue. By disallowing contraception, Humanae Vitae undermined human freedom of conscience. Yes, the sacred cows of our Masonic world order, freedom of conscience, has been undermined. In her mind, Paul VI is the originator of real suffering for Catholics, when the Church declared what the Church has always taught, that the use of contraception was a mortal sin, and a particularly grave mortal sin. This suffering began because the Church had, quote, intruded into the sexual practices of the spouses, unquote. Note that according to this logic, sexuality has a higher meaning than the faith and sanctity, as any place the Church cannot tread is a place of greater value than the Church and the faith itself. The rather misguided professor says she regrets the restrictive doctrinal attitude which is distant from real life. Therefore, according to her logic, if we can call it that, the Church was incapable of addressing the sexual needs of her priests in a right manner. Those are her words, not mine. I would never talk about the so-called sexual needs of priests in a serious way, or really any way in public at all. But anyway, this is, in her mind, makes the present scandals a homemade crisis because of the Church's restrictive teaching on sexuality. In her view, many couples distanced themselves from the Church after Humanae Vitae. In her own view, it was the lack of being able to speak about sexuality and the frustration about this fact that caused priests to go seeking sexual contact with other men and women and also with children. Again, those are her words. In other words, Humanae Vitae created a slippery slope that started with Catholics not being able to use chemicals to kill their pregnancies in the early stages of their development, and has brought us to Ted McCarrick preying on children and seminarians. If you can follow that logic, or lack thereof, and keep a straight face, I congratulate you. But she was being extremely serious. Pope Benedict, in his own response to Ashman's critique, points out that she does not mention God even once. Well, he wrote that a, quote, world without God can only be a world without meaning, end quote. He also quotes his own words of the April letter, according to which society in the West is forgetting God, and with it loses its, quote, measure for humanity. As far as I can see, he continues, God does not appear in the most of the reactions to my contribution, and with it exactly that is not being discussed, which I wanted to stress as kernel of the question. The fact, the retired pope continues, shows me the seriousness of a situation in which the word God in theology often seems to stand at the margins. And this is the main thrust of the problem. Our secularizing culture has elevated the most basest of our inclinations to such a high level it has come to replace God himself. Not only is this idolatry, but it's a particularly insidious form of idolatry. I'd call it a stupid form of idolatry, but all idolatry is, by definition, rather stupid. Just remember the scenes in the Old Testament where Abraham comes down the mountain and discovers that his followers had crafted a stupid little golden statue for them to worship as a deity practically the moment he went up the mountain to commune with God, and you'll see just how stupid idolatry actually is. And that is exactly what our culture does today. Instead of crafting a stupid little statue to worship, we have forgotten God and invented a new one based on our animalistic passions, and in so doing, we have clouded our collective intellect to such a degree that the most abominable crimes are now normal and funded by our government, and that those who advocate for those abominable crimes are not coincidentally advocating now for ending clerical celibacy, and advocating for the creation of a pagan priesthood through women's ordination, which would thereby further paganize the Catholic faith and what already is going on just in the advocacy for this weird Amazon Synod. These things are always linked together, which this author makes abundantly clear in her criticism of Benedict's April statement, when she links Humanae Vitae to the present crisis of the clergy and the Church. I'm going to close this with a quote from Chesterton. Quote, "Some say religion is the opium of the people. I should say religion is the opium of the people. I should say that in every fact and phase of history, religion had been necessary as the stimulant of the people." End quote. In this context, I'd suggest that irreligion's stimulant is sex. Nothing gets the secularist and modernist mind really going like sex. The elevation of sex to a sacrament, at least if not to a religion itself, has led to the most grotesque sins imaginable. Yet here we are in a state today where crimes just a few generations ago would have been truly imaginable in the Western mind are not only normalized now, but are considered a right, and the Church is considered to have overstepped its bounds by teaching the truth about these crimes. In truth, these people want a church that doesn't tell them when they're wrong, but only confirms them in their sins, and then reaffirms them when they are actually right. That is at the core of our problems today, both the elevation of sex to a religion itself and the denial of the authority of the Church to speak for God on matters of morality. After all, personal conscience rules the day, a concept that is on its face ludicrous. Yes, the Church says that the well-formed conscience of the individual cannot be violated, even by authorities within the Church. But here's the rub. The conscience must be, as I said, well-formed. And a well-formed conscience will not go against what the Church has always taught. The hard teachings on celibacy and human sexuality are nothing new. They go back to the apostolic age, and this is something the modernists cannot take. Even clerical celibacy goes back to the apostolic age, even if it wasn't formalized in the West and mandated by canon law until the Middle Ages. It's one of the great lies of our time that not permitting priests to engage in the marital act is the reason that a few have committed heinous crimes, when in point of fact, the reason that they committed these crimes in the first place is that many men who were not morally fit to be in the priesthood were recruited by revolutionaries in order to undermine or even destroy the Church. That is a historical fact, and one that the present revolutionaries will never acknowledge. To resist this, I'll just ask that you keep praying for the Church and keep Benedict in your prayers. His statement is getting a lot of pushback from the modernists who'd wish he'd just shut up and go away and keep quiet. But frankly, getting some semblance of sanity from anyone in the Vatican these days is very much needed and a breath of fresh air. Thank you for listening. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.